What's going on, everybody? And welcome back to the Marvel Pair Up podcast, where we look at every episode of each Disney Plus show for the MCU and pair it up within the genre it's in to give you a fun history of the genre, the influences of it, the movies that defined it, and how all of those have culminated into whichever chapter of the MCU you are in. So if you're a Marvel fan and like dumb movie history, this is the place for you. If you've been with us since WandaVision, welcome back. And if you're joining us now, go back and listen to all of the WandaVision and forward ones. As always, I'm your host, Blake Schultz, and with me is Jamie Durack.
Hello.
And Terrence Tatum.
Hello, everyone.
And we are kicking off our new mini-series. I guess they're all technically mini-series within the series. It's a very meta idea. And we are now at Ms. Marvel, which of course brings us to the teen coming of age genre. And in this episode specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about Ms. Marvel, a little bit about the genre itself, because in prepping for this episode, I realized this genre expands to so many smaller. There's like the college coming of age, the high school coming of age, the regular ones, sex comedies, teen comedies. And all of it won't be part of Ms. Marvel, but a lot of it will influence where we are. So we're going to go with Ms. Marvel. What defines this genre? The 50s, 60s, and 70s. And let's kick it off, guys. What did y'all think of Ms. Marvel's first episode?
Oh, it's so cute. It's so fun. It's such a nice change of pace after like all the trauma that the MCU is throwing our way. Like, don't get me wrong, I love the trauma, but like it's nice to have like a girl who's doing fanfic and just trying to live her high school life, and it's really sweet, and I like that a lot. I feel like we're about to enter the like fun era this year with this, Thor, and She-Hulk. We're gonna get some we're gonna be able to just have a nice little time, which is, again, not to say trauma time's not bad. It's just, this is refreshing. She's great. And it's just so awesome that in real life, she's such a Marvel nerd, because it just makes it all feel more genuine. And I love that, because we all are her. We all are Marvel nerds, and it's like we're all being represented, and not just us as Marvel nerds, but culturally people who haven't been represented in this way are being represented, and that's awesome too. It's just like all across the board, adorable. And Kevin Feige, let's get AvengerCon ASAP. We need it
happening now. Let's do it. I'm in that same boat. I thought this was adorable. On the road that we're doing, and as I've gone down in history, I'm like, I think teen comedies might be one of my favorite genres of film. And the more and more I think about it, I'm like, oh yeah. And it's weird because obviously each of these come out and they're talking about a new age of teens. I'm always aged up beyond that, but I still feel like, nope, this is placing me back into that moment when like, oh yeah, this party means so much to me, or this con in this case means so much to me. I got to find a way to get out of this. You still can relate to that. And this does a really good job of putting me back into that childhood element, and like, oh yeah. And it does it in an amazingly stylized way. Like, it gave me some Scott Pilgrim vibes. I was like, oh, I'm all in on all of this. Doing the text messaging through the signs on the window and through the street. I'm like, this is some of that, just you're out thinking out the box and just having a ball with this. And you're right, Jamie. She is a delight. Like, I could watch her do anything, and I've gone down the rabbit hole of now watching all of her like press conferences and her stuff. I was like, she's a full-on geek and nerd. She's upset about Black Bolt stuff. She's just like fangirling over Robert. I was like, I love this girl. And when it was all said and done, I was like, I can't wait to get more of this. This teen coming of age story. You're right. It is sort of a reprieve off of all the angst and grief that we've gotten in all of these Marvel TV shows. It's the first one that's kind of like, let's go have fun this way. And I truly appreciate that. And I also you mentioned it, I am really, really happy that a group of folks get to have representation. I know how that felt when Black Panther happened and we all lost our damn mind. I'm hoping that this happens the same for everybody who is now getting some type of representation on screen for them.
I want to say my biggest complaint about the show is that it's only 6 episodes, because I want to talk about all the teen movies forever, because it's also one of I'm obsessed with teen movies. I'm so excited for this journey that we're about to take, but I'm like upset because there's so much I want to talk about that like we're not going to have time to talk about because there's only 6 episodes.
I know. I think this is one genre, and Jamie, I'm kind of glad that you put us in a place that's very similar to when we did WandaVision, of like this decade by decade evolution of it, where since WandaVision, it's been more thematic. And I think this is a genre, and even the idea of being a teenager and growing up through these years is so well paralleled by the movies, especially with the three that we're going to get into soon, that I'm like, that we could do this forever. Especially with things that I learned that I'm going to talk about after we finish talking about this episode. But I agree with everything you guys said. Everybody who knows me and knows the show and knows us knows that WandaVision has been and probably will continue to be my favorite MCU show by leaps and bounds. But this pilot was my favorite pilot since that. I felt kind of that same weird, I hate to say magic, but like that weird magic of like, oh, we're really doing something that while we've done in the context of like the film industry, we haven't really done in the MCU. And I'm sure everyone's going to be like, Spider-Man Homecoming, but hear me out. That's not really a high school teen coming of age story. That is a superhero mentor story with John Hughes homages. This is like full on her relationship with her parents. She's rebelling, she's growing up. Everything you guys said about diversity and inclusion. And while I am like a white, straight, cis male, I always find that when we do these things with more diversity, I'm so much more interested because it is giving me a piece of a genre I didn't really know before. There was so much in the culture and in how they talked and the dynamic of her and her parents that was so unique to this story and this character that I loved watching, because I haven't seen that spin on it before. This other take that is so similar, but so different at the same time. And Terrence, you're right. All this like Edgar Wright light stuff. There's drawing, even just the opening of her like explaining the MCU to us with this like pop-up book. I immediately was like, this is it. Like,
you got me. I'm sold. Let's do it.
And it really shows where the MCU always shines, when like there's obviously a formula. Even these TV shows have a formula. We all know it. We like it. But whenever they really kind of go just slightly left to their normal formula and throw in some change is when I get the most excited. And even just intros like that, I was like, I love this. This is also why I liked Iron Man 3 with the dumb little crayon drawing. I love all of this, just like how it's impacted other people. We've never seen, and we've seen glimpses of it. I think about Thor Ragnarok, when those two girls are, I'm such a fan, take our photo, and there's been action figures and signings, and it almost feels like a more benevolent version of The Boys, where like that's so much superheroes are a corporation, and this is like they're just celebrities and famous and people like them. I do want to talk about Avenger Con, because I, as a like filmmaking person, immediately was like, how expensive was that set? How long did that take? And I bet this was one day and we're never coming back. And if we get an assembled documentary, I just want the production designer to be like, I worked for months
on this
to build this nonsense for them to shoot it like 3 times. We're never coming back to that set. Everything else is going to be smaller. But even just to see how the fandom in that world is, I also was like, who's getting paid for Avenger Con? Because we know Sam's not making any money, and there's no more Shield. I was like, so there is some weird corporation somewhere making money off of these guys, and I want to know about
that. That's interesting.
Yeah, like none of these folks, I mean, 2 of them are gone, and Thor doesn't care about money.
You know, you say Shield is gone, but is it because in No Way Home or Far From Home, even though they weren't the real Nick Fury and Maria Hill, they still were
there is a Shield around.
Of course, you know, in the world of Agents of Shield it exists, but that's still an unknown factor.
It's all of this, I think the one thing too, because you mentioned No Way Home, people like with that too. There's two parts. One, Spider-Man at the beginning of that was already full on super. He was a hero at that point, so it wasn't like he was gaining anything. He sort of knew the hero part of it. But I think the big point is we've all mentioned the cultural identity, but we're doing a coming of age of a young lady, which we haven't had that in this world either. Like this has all been dudes up to this point, besides Black Widow, who's been well trained up to that point. So seeing a young girl grow, that's also pretty awesome to me too.
Even like Kate Bishop's like there, but she's herself.
Yeah, so she's pretty knows who she is at that point.
Like there's nothing like she's so like confident, and she is like 20, like she's like in certain stories like she could be, but she's not.
Yeah, but like to get something so small, and it just it's a throwaway look, but just to see her and how her mom keeps responding, like, you don't want to wear those sexy outfits. And I'm like, oh yeah, I guess that would be different for her as a woman, and her looking at her costume and like not, I was like, oh, I'm not a young girl, but Jesus, that broke my heart.
The moment for me that I was like, whoa, was when she was trying on dresses with her mother, and somebody was like, you're too short. And her mother's like, she's not. But then her mother's friend came in and said she was too short. And her mother then agreed. And I was like, oh, that's some shit my mom would do. Where she would like had my back until her friend showed up. And now she doesn't anymore. I was like, oh, that was so good. I felt that one deep in my soul.
Yeah, there were a lot of small relatable moments of just like, I've also like in the most tame way rebelled against my parents, where it is just like, I just want to go to like Chicago, and they're like, oh, the big city, you're young. And it's like, I'm not doing drugs or having sex or smoking. Like, just let me go to the museum. Like like the smallest stakes that at the time are just so big and consequential. Yeah, everything is world ending, and if you don't get it, it's gone forever. But it had so many other moments too, of like the dad dressed like the Hulk, and her like it hurts him because he's trying, but it's still embarrassing, and it's not quite the point. And you're like, oh God,
like I felt bad for everybody in that room. I was like, Jesus, I hurt for all of you.
Yeah, it's.
I would have been. If like my mom had painted herself green, I would have been like, yes. That was a moment where I'm like, girl, I don't know, he's really trying.
He's trying.
Oh, I've 100% had that with my parents, where they're like, I'm gonna play video games with you and your friends, and I'm like, no. And then they're like, oh, but I wanted to do that. It's like, it's very a Goofy movie where it's like, I want to be a part of your life still. And it's such a specific window of time to like do a coming of age, because I feel like the parent relationship is like, I need them for like food and to not die, and then like I need them like just a little bit, and then I'm going to tell myself that I don't need you for anything ever, and everything you do is wrong, uncool, and dumb.
Right.
And then it's like, I was wrong about everything.
You're my best friend. Friends. Please, yes.
And then you become like 30 and you're like, you don't know anything. Neither do I. And that's okay.
I love the touch of the mom who kept calling the con a party. Because it was like, that's such a like you're not listening or understanding what this is. Stop calling it a party. You're just
you already have in your brain what this is, and you're not listening to what I'm saying.
It's the mom every Christmas who wants to buy her son a Nintendo. And that's just what every video game system is. It was so like, oh my God, they just got all the idiosyncrasies and behaviors. It was perfect. It was the whole thing. It's such a stupid gripe, and it's not even really a gripe. It's more just like a joke I made. She sneaks out of her house on that tree. The branch breaks and she falls. And I was like, ooh, that would hurt. And then the branch lands on top of her. And a part of me was like, that is the most unrealistic thing in the MCU. I would not get up. I would not have gotten up from that.
She's maybe like 98, 99 pounds. That tree would hurt a lot.
Oh, I was like, oh man. I was like, she doesn't have her powers yet, Marvel. Iron Man falls from the sky in like Iron Man 1 in a metal suit and stuck in the sand for a week. And I'm like, sure, totally. Why not?
Yeah.
I'm like, nah, I've fallen out of trees. This nonsense.
You're not just walking that off.
Yeah. It's like, oh man, she doesn't need her powers. She's perfect. I also love too, it was very Edgar Wright, where that giant hammer swings and hits the bully. And the bully, guys, this is such a great
you gotta have one.
Evolution of like, and I think Spider-Man also did it well, and then we kind of made Flash Thompson like a frenemy. But it's like, yeah, I don't really need not that I dislike it, but the Sam Raimi Flash Thompson where it's like, well, I don't want to fight me neither. And I'm like, I don't know that that's a relevant type of bully now, but
Not
this
anymore.
was so subtle and
Mm-hmm.
mean, and you hate it. You hate it. You even then hate it because I've always made jokes. Jamie and I talked about this at WonderCon, where I was like, there's always so many great costumes, and then there's just like a dude with abs who just like he wins Wolverine because he just looks like Wolverine.
And you just trot out the blonde, good-looking girl in a half-assed Captain Marvel outfit, and they're gonna win that.
And even when she was like, she doesn't even like the superheroes, I was like, look, we don't want to gatekeep here, Kamala, but I have been there where my bullies have walked into the GameStop I walked in and bought Call of Duty, and I was like, no, I got all the Pokemon, I saved the princess, I got the Chaos Emeralds. You don't get to come around here now and parade around with your biceps like you're some person who does this, you imposter. But I loved it. I thought all of it was good.
I love that her friend is crushing on her and she's not quite aware of it.
Okay, I was confused because I assumed the first half of that episode that child was gay. And then at that moment, I was like, oh, I misread this situation entirely. And then in the con, when she saves her, I thought they had a moment. So I was like, I'm really misreading what's happening. When I was like, okay, I need to reverse my brain because I just assumed that kid was gay. But that's great that he's good for him. You're allowed to be straight, children.
Hey, he might be just testing it out. Yeah.
Oh man, yeah, I'm very excited to see where it goes. I think the only thing we didn't really talk about is her powers. They've changed. It doesn't bother me.
Does that bother you? I know I've read this comic and I know her powers are very different. What's weird though, and bravo to the writers, everything else is exactly the same.
It's perfect.
Changed her power where she got her power set, so I don't have a problem with it.
Isn't it Terrigenesis
or
like
the mist? Yeah, she gets hit with the mist. She's an inhuman basically, which they're kind of wiping out.
Like, I mean, or if they like, maybe they'll incorporate them somehow, but they not to do that. So what are you supposed to do? Not have the character at all?
And in theory, we don't know where those bracelets come from. It could still be from some type of. It seems cosmic the way that it all looks, but it could be inhuman. Like we don't know. So it's hard to get.
About to show up.
I don't agree with the notion that they're changing it because of Mr. Fantastic. I think that's ridiculous. We've had so many people with the same powers.
So punch kick folks before. I don't see how we would start doing that.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know why that would be the thing. I don't have any evidence, but there is a part of me that's like, narratively, I get what they're saying. Her powers came from the Terrigen Mist, which at the time of the comics was a very big part of the overall story of that time. We're now going to change her powers to be something that's big to the overall story of the MCU so that it's thematically a one-to-one. Mm-hmm. There's a small part of me that wonders if this is also simply cheaper than making stretchy super good-looking powers the whole time.
Right.
But no, it doesn't bother me at all. Do you know how many things we've changed about comics since the X-Men wore black suits?
I was going to say X-Men 1 and 2 were still some of my favorite comic book movies ever, and they were wearing black Matrix outfits.
Yeah, so. Don't speak to me to the old magic. I was there when it was written. I've seen all the changes.
Yeah,
Green Goblin was running around like a Stephen King character. I don't care. It's fine. You had organic webs to non-organic webs. We've done this so often. Get over it.
Yeah. Which is why now, I didn't care about the whole Doctor Strange 616 thing until I heard her argument in real life.
Nope, that's been bothering me the whole time.
I never really did. But then I'm like, no, she's right. She's right.
I was full of rage when they did that. I have done a lot of work on my Don't Be an Angry Nerd, but when we did Mysterio 616, but he's a liar. And then when they were like, actually, Mysterio was correct. It is 616, but now the comics and this.
Yeah.
That's where I was like, how dare you?
Oh, don't you
so
do
when
this.
She was on that carpet, look, guys, I'm glad to be here, but let's get some things straight. I was like, yes. That's 100%. If I was ever a director of these movies, I'd be like, we got to undo that, guys. It's got to be a mistake. 8-4 whatever was wrong. 616 is somewhere else. We've decided. Should we get into these coming of age movies?
Oh, please. Oh my God. I want to talk
All
about
right.
that.
So at the top of the show, I mentioned we were going through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. What I don't think I did was tell you the movies. We're doing Rebel Without a Cause for the 50s. We are doing Beach Party for the 60s and American Graffiti for the 70s. And before we really dive into this, I want to quote an article that I found, because as I was looking at the why of Rebel Without a Cause, what I learned, and I don't know if anybody knew this before me, was that the term teenager really came about in 1944. That until then, we didn't really have a word for youth culture. And then my dumb brain went down a huge rabbit hole, and I'm going to take 5 minutes of our podcast now to really get into this. But first, I want to quote this excerpt. I'm going to look at my other screen because I also want to cite this correctly. This is taken from Teenage, the Creation of Youth Culture from 1874 to 1945. First appearing in a published play text by Glenn Waldron for the Boundless Theater production. During 1944, Americans started to use the word teenager to describe the place of youth in their society. From the very beginning, it was a marketing term that recognized the spending power of adolescence within a culture that thought of business in terms of national identity and individual freedom. The fact that youth had become a market also meant that it had become a discrete, separate age group with its own peer-generated rituals, rights, and demands. They then coined the word teenager and marked the emancipation of adolescence, which I think is fascinating. Because then when you look at what was happening in the 50s as we returned from war, right before Rebel Without a Cause came out, a lot of states started getting rid of child labor laws, factory laws, and suddenly teenagers were just out and about and living their lives after school. Cars were becoming more accessible. Music was exploding. There were counterculture scenes happening. All of these things were starting to bubble up, and there was no real word. Because before that, even in film, and this is going to lead into Rebel Without a Cause, because this what piqued my interest was how were adolescents handled in movies before that. And I immediately, if you know me, you know that I love old gangster movies. So I went to James Cagney, and I go all the way back to the 1930s during the Hays Code, when it was if you're going to make gangster movies, they basically need to be PSAs. The Hays Code said you can't glorify something bad. So these have to be warnings. So specifically Scarface and Public Enemy, and I think Little Caesar was in there, but I don't think it had the exact same, this big opening of the teenager, not the teenager, but they're the adolescent, they're obsessed with the gangster culture. The mobs are out there and they're influencing our youth and they're taking it and things are getting bad. They would die, they would tragedies, young people corrupted by something, and then this would happen. This went on really until White Heat in the late 50s, one of James Cagney's last big gangster movies before he went independent, blah, 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 blah. And it was the first time that he did a movie that sort of glorified being bad. And critics hated it. They were worried. There was, not unlike today, what is this doing to the children? They're going to see us glorify this. Yeah.
I mean, White Heat is pretty wild. I watched it. I took an American Gangster class in college, and that was one of the first things we watched. But it is funny because we could do a whole other podcast on how people incorrectly perceive gangster movies and how
I'm waiting for that gangster show.
Yeah.
One day there will be a gangster show we can do.
People with their Scarface memorabilia and stuff, and it's
the black culture has adopted Scarface like it's its best friend. Guys, you've taken all the wrong things from this movie.
I'm not a big Scarface fan. I prefer.
It's not really a good movie either, but that's a whole different side. That's another conversation.
Yeah.
So that, of course, brings us to Rebel Without a Cause. We've now taken the teenager out of the B-list role. Teenage kids are out, they're swinging like so many others. They want representation. And it's so funny to think that there was a time where white teenage boys were but where am I in the movies? But it happened. And Warner Brothers leapt right on it. I think it's so funny how many of these movies are so counterculture and rebellious, and thinking that we created teenage and coming of age to market them and bring them right into the system they were fighting is the best irony of this whole genre now. Is I'm like, oh man, I didn't know we just created that word to be like, sell them stuff, make them feel seen. So it came out. And similar, I think, to the gangster movies, as we transitioned out of them and into this, he is a hero, he's confused, he's lost, but in so many ways, it's still a tragedy. We're sort of glorifying it, but we're sort of giving warnings. But I've talked enough. Jamie, how do you like Rebel Without a Cause?
So one of the reasons I had picked this is because I'd never seen it and I wanted to see it. And I thought it was great. And it's interesting because for most of the movies we're doing for this podcast are much lighter than this. This is definitely, I think, probably the most dramatic we are going to get on this podcast. Most of what we're doing is very cutesy, but this movie is dark, and it adds to the darkness that all three leads died tragically in real life. Which, like,
yeah, I didn't realize that Maneo was stabbed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're right, all of them.
All three of them had like tragic deaths, and that like adds to the whole ickiness of it. And it's intense. That knife fight scene, I was like on the edge of my seat and scared. And the end, it was the whole movie. But it's interesting because it's like, it also is icky and weird. It's a weird movie. All the parent stuff is weird. Her relationship with her father is fucked up, because what's happening there is that he is trying to suppress his daughter's sexuality because he clearly wants to fuck her himself.
He's attracted to her.
But he's trying to like push those feelings down, and so all she wants is for him to be her daddy, and he won't do that because he's trying to draw a line so he doesn't try to fuck his own daughter, and that's screwing with her because she doesn't realize that's what's happening. She just thinks her father doesn't love her anymore. And then I loved James Dean's father in this movie. I can't think of the actor's name, but it's Thurston Howell III from Gilligan's Island. Yes. That's how I know him. And I really loved his character. Just this kind of bumbling, he's just embarrassed by his dad and the way that his dad lets his mom walk all over him, and just all the parental dynamics, the Saul's character, the fact that his parents aren't around, you never meet them. He just has his nanny. And that's it. And I really loved all the parent dynamics in this, and that's not something a lot of teen movies really focus on, because it's all about the teens. And anyway, yes, I really, what's interesting, when we get to American Graffiti, I want to talk a little bit more about this, but I'm going to wait till we get there, because there's, I think, an interesting juxtaposition between both films. But in between, we got Dog Beach Party. So that's my Rebel Without a Cause reaction.
This is my second time seeing Rebel. It's been a long time since I've seen it. This is like one of those, because of what happened to James and how he's been he's an iconic person. Same with Natalie, she is as well. But I watched this a while ago, and it didn't mean as much to me back in the day. But now that I watch this as an adult and seeing them play teens at that time, probably for the first time that you actually got to see teens be teens, because usually they were a prop. They were like the side or a B story on the sideline. You really didn't get to lead with them. This opens with them and closes with them, and you just get to go on that angsty road, like him moving from town to town. He goes to that new school trying to kind of fit in, and he gets into a fight, and it just just spirals down from that. I want to piggyback a bit off of what you said, Jamie, how all the parental figures, they're all terrible. They're all bad in some way or another. But it's funny to me because the sheriff at the very beginning is probably the best parental figure to James, to Jim in the entire movie. Like, he pulls him to the side, like, hey, let's have a conversation. His parents try to follow him in that room, like, nope, just gonna be me and him. I want to have a convo with him. And even with the punch that he tries to throw on him, he knows, like, this kid's, there's something going on here. We need to get to the bottom of that. And like, he just takes the time to kind of figure that out. I was like, hey, if you need to contact me. I was like, wow, this officer at the very beginning of this movie is the only father figure that he's had in this entire movie, because no one else has been that person for him. And that stuck with me as, oh, that's kind of a cool way to open this movie. And then you have Natalie trying to, the love that she's not getting from her dad, that she's missing, she's trying to get from every other male that she can. She's just hanging out with dudes all the time, which doesn't necessarily mean anything, but the way that we see it, she's just trying to recreate that male attention. And unfortunately, the male gaze is not looking at from her father. She's trying to get it from everywhere else. Poor Paulo. I mean, Plato. That's a rough character. That is a rough character. I felt bad for him. Anytime that he felt abandoned, I was like, oh, somebody hug this boy. And the part that got me the most, and I like never been there, but we get different worlds of teens for each decade that we go along, but just to know that your parents will send you a check and be like, that's all they think of you. It's like, here's some money, be gone. I don't care enough to call you, think about you, even see what is going on in your life. I don't care. I've paid for my debts. That's all I owe to you as a parent. That is wild.
It's interesting because yes, to all of that. I also just love the look and feel of the movie, especially, watching Marvel movies and Jurassic World and everything like today, and to go back to like anything with CinemaScope and Technicolor and these long, deep shots. Like it's such a like lost art of how we used to do it. And there was even something watching it this time where I was like, oh, it's almost like the movie is so challenging thematically and story-wise, but it's almost oddly soothing in its like style and direction, because you're just like, oh, everything's very bright and nice and everyone looks good and it's so stylized. And I think that helps kind of almost juxtapose the era where so much stuff was propagandized to be like this ideal family and all of these things. And the reason this movie, Jamie's right, is the most intense that we're probably going to touch on. You could probably make arguments for some of them. I feel like a lot of these movies do have some stuff that's like, oh, it's rough. Growing up is rough. But this one is so part of that cultural shift where we were really starting to be like, hey, all the stuff that you guys had pre-war, like the world is different now.
Mm-hmm.
All of this is wrong. Like every scene with his dad leading up to him, like attacking him, is him just being like, tell me what to do. And stop giving, yeah. And it's, I feel like that was what a lot of people that age at that time were screaming, because so much was happening. So many industries were changing. There was so much like growth and confusion and weird stigmas happening. And if you weren't this perfect family, this Norman Rockwell painting, everything was wrong. And no one got an answer. I think it happens a lot today right now too. I feel like there's a lot of people younger than us, and even us sometimes, being like, hey, can someone tell me what to do? Because the whole like go to college and then buy a house thing, not happening.
It's not working.
So like, what am I going to do now? And then the people who are supposed to tell you are like, I don't know.
Got nothing. Shit's changed. I don't know.
And it's very funny because I think it kind of flips on its head some of the other stuff we were talking about. Because obviously the movie, even on Warner Bros. On HBO Max, is still be like, a tragedy is in the genre description. So there is still kind of this weird like 40s gangster tone of like, people are going to make it and there's sort of a warning here, but the warning is almost to the parents and like old ideologies. And it's so much more, to Terrence's point, when it opens up on like, I want to help you, nobody else is coming now. It's almost a weird warning of like, hey, the kids are changing. And if you as the parents and adults don't listen to them and help them,
this is what's
going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to before, where it was like, and if you let your children out at night, if they go around with a man with a hat tipped, he's going to come back a booze hound. Like now we're like, boo, we got to straighten up and fly right. It's great because that's so much of how that genre then went forward. And I think that then brings us into the 60s, because so much else was like a knockoff of this for so long, until they embraced the comedy side of this genre. And then even further is Beach Party, a movie I don't think, had any of us seen Beach Party before this?
No, and I part of me is like wishes that I had before, so that I could have just been like, no, let's make this full episode about the beach party genre, because it's fascinating. I watched the first two because I needed to know more, and I'm going to watch them all. 100%.
Yeah, that was the first thing that I noticed. I looked it up and it was like the first of 7. I'm like, I'm sorry, what now?
Oh, this was the American Pie of that time. There's like 3 that are for real, and then a bunch of like, hey,
like, Frankie and Annette are in a lot of
about 80% of them, they're in there. Yeah.
And this was exciting for me because obviously Grease is my favorite movie of all time. So I'm familiar with Frankie because he sings Beauty School Dropout, but Frankie and Annette as a duo in our childhood, they were very much like cameo staples. They appeared in so much stuff. They were in an episode of Full House. They have this cute moment in True Beverly Hills. To me, I kind of grew up knowing them as like, they were famous back in the day, so now they're cameos, and there's a little bit and I know who they are because I watched these things. And so to actually see them so young, not teenagers though, and do it, this movie was so weird.
So weird. Weird.
I was like, I almost don't know where to start with it. And I feel like this is going to be very similar to small rants we did during our What If one, where it was like, to really understand this movie, you need to understand these weird studio idiosyncrasies and how these companies evolved and changed. Because this was AIP, the American International Pictures. And apparently what I was reading is that they were trying to revive like juvenile delinquent stories at first. And they wanted to kind of go back to this like Gangster meets Rebel Without a Cause. We're now like 8 or 9 years away from that. And they were like, it's time. And the director was like, no, what teenagers want now is like freedom, sexuality, music. So we need them to be in skimpy costumes. We need music going, and it's gotta be funny. And they just did that. And like some of these other companies that I feel like this still happens. We talk so much of like the Western to the superheroes and genres, and the beach genre like took over Hollywood for 5 years in the 60s, to the point that even like Surf's Up, Joker's Down, the like infamous Batman 66 episode, was trying to do this. Like the amount of things it hit, every studio tried to do these giant polished versions of it, and everyone was like, no, we want the cheap grungy AIP ones. Get your high budgets out of here.
You're spending too much money on this. Please stop.
And you know, in watching it, and it's crazy. So for people who don't know, before I get into like, I can see every comedy I love in this movie.
Before you get into, I just want to say to our audiences, if you're listening to this and you have not seen Beach Party, pause this podcast right now and go watch Beach Party, because we will not do it justice in our explanations. Also, there's such a good cameo that we are going to spoil that you need to learn for yourself. So stop and listen. Sorry, Blake, continue.
Yeah, it's impossible to do this movie justice because it's bonkers. The story follows two adolescents who are just going to a beach house. They're singing a lovely song, and they keep saying it'll be like we're married.
Yeah, it's just going to be the two of us. It'll be like we're married. We're fine.
Which I think sets up in such a weird way how great both of their characters are. Because one guy is like, it means we're going to be married, which means we're going to screw around. And the girl is like, it's going to be like we're married, which means like, I'm going to be his gal.
Nobody else for you. Just you and I forever.
And then she has invited
everyone.
Every person.
Every person they know is living in this beach house with them, which is amazing that somebody wanted to not have sex so badly that they were like, I will throw a rager on this beach for a week to stop you from having sex with me.
And it's so comical because it's like a tiny little cabin and they're just like floor to floor,
just thrown out people to people, like they're just centipede of people on top of each other, and it's insane.
It's so, and I'm sure if you saw this movie in 1963, you had seen nothing like it. When I really think about this, and I even think about other comedies of the time, I'm like, oh, of course this blew up. There was nothing else did this.
So unlike anything else on screen.
Yeah, this must have been how they felt when I saw American Pie for the first time. It was like, whoa, I didn't even know. The villain, who I still think he's just like a less suave Ian Malcolm. He has a couple of those like
I would not call him the villain of this movie.
I mean, Jamie. he's studying them and comparing them to
he's the creep of this movie.
Sure, but he's also the top billed person. This was not. He must. Robert Cummings.
Jack Nicholson was the top billed person in Batman '89.
Well, yeah. But I think that like this was like it's him, his assistant, whose name I don't know, and then Frankie and Annette. Like Frankie and Annette weren't carrying movies then. Like he is. I loved this guy.
Marianne,
great.
Dorothy Malone. Dorothy Malone was the actress.
He's weird, but like it was like this. Like you keep bringing up American Pie, and I kept thinking about American Pie too, because the comedy in this movie was weird, and it was sexual, not as blatantly sexual.
No,
what we're getting in '99, but
for that time, it probably was though. It probably equated to what it was at that time. Yeah,
and it's like but I don't know if I'd call him the villain, but anyway, he
going. Was when he popped
the
out
antagonist.
And started watching them, I was like, okay, all right, what are we doing? What is going on?
Because the villains are the biker gang.
The biker gang. That's like one of them is like the spoof off of like a quasi Marlon Brando at that time, because he had just done I forgot which movie it was, but they were spoofing him. But yeah, that's the sort of quote unquote villain. If there is even one in this.
He won me over, the main guy, when he literally came. The biker had grabbed Annette, who's named Dee Dee in these movies. I don't know why she's not Annette.
And he's like, you're molesting this woman.
He's like, excuse me, sir. I hate to interrupt, but you're molesting this young lady. like,
yeah.
Stop this.
All right, he's not a villain, but he is like an antagonist to the teens. Sure. In a way, he's stopping them from the goal. He's studying them. Yes, we then meet a crazy biker gang. There's people having sex behind surfboards as if everybody on the beach is only going to see them from the same view as us, the audience.
Correct.
They just put up a surfboard and like, that does it. There will be anybody behind us or to the sides. The professor is able to put you in time stasis by touching your temple the right way. He's constantly referring to, I don't even know what the correct term would be, indigenous peoples of other tribes that he's studied in not terrible, but not great ways either. He, we have a whole sequence where he has to shave and become this younger, I'm a new me. He like morphs into this like Austin Powers character. The movie's incredible. There's original songs.
Yeah. Well, that's what it's funny because I remember when I used to watch American Idol. I remember when they made that from Justin Kelly, and I'm like, why would they make that movie? This is dumb. And I'm like, oh, this is exactly what they were trying to go off of. Like, this is literally what they were trying to. Now it sucked, but that's what they were trying to recreate. I'm like, oh, there's an entire genre of this that exists.
For me, it was Animal House. That's what I was like, oh, this is proto Van Wilder. This is just like they're gonna take this dynamic and put it in a college. And that's going to make the like college sex coming of age stories. That's where I very much was like, oh, I see how this influenced everything that I know.
It's funny to me though, because I feel like this, whereas Rebel With a Cause felt like they were actually hearing and listening to what those teens were thinking about. This one feels like more like adults were saying, this is all that teens want. Like teens are all about sex and dancing and partying. And that's what a teen is.
And that's so much like what the 60s became, is like all the counterculture was like, look at what the teens are doing now. They're out of their dances and having sex. It's almost what like Red's point of view in that 70s show is, where he's just like, you kids are just running around, drinking beer and sex everywhere in between. Like whatever he's like, I can't think of the exact line, but he's like, it's just party all day, dance all night, and sex everywhere in between.
I've been rewatching that 70s show, and I just want to say to the world that the fact that Kurtwood Smith and Deborah Jo Rupp never got nominated for Emmys is an absolute stain on the history of television.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Oh yeah. And it's funny because I was watching this and my roommate was like, this doesn't pair with Ms. Marvel. And it was the one area where I was like, yeah, I don't think the show we're watching is going to become like a sex romp at any point. But it definitely has a lot of the same like themes of rebellion and discovery and independence and experimentation and just like, I want to know who I am, and other people wanting to, and like quite literally, the observing of it from the outside, I think, has such an impact on what these movies become. It's like it's very literal in this, but there's always a parental or dean or whatever it is, like watching the new generation in almost every single one of these movies, whether it's the dad in American Pie or like the dean in every Van Wilder movie, or like in this one, her parents are obviously watching, and there's always somebody while the character is growing up, there's always somebody else who's grown trying to understand them at the same time. That's usually the juxtaposition you get, and I feel like it's very on the nose here, but it's great. It's such a beautiful little era of time, and this like
it is
weird
very
relic.
much a time capsule, very much a time capsule of the era. I was watching this and I'm like, wait, the hell is Vincent Price? Vincent Price is here? What are we doing?
Very big surprise. The whole movie, Tony's like, who's ever under that hat in the background better be good. And it was a good reveal. And I want to just quickly say that I watched the second movie, which isn't quite as good, but still pretty good. And it had in the middle the most bananas scene. I can't even describe how insane the scene is. The whole movie's not as crazy, but this one scene. And then in the end, the like hidden person of that scene shows up, and it's another great cameo. And I won't spoil that one because you guys haven't seen it. But Vincent Price, it comes back at some point in one of these movies and like stars in it with Frankie Avalon. I don't remember what's the title, but there is going to be another like Vincent Price beach party movie coming up on this list.
I love it.
I think it's time to bring the beach party movies back.
Let's do it.
I guess they tried in like 1987.
Well, they did like Frankie and Annette came back for like the return.
Yeah.
But a couple of years ago, maybe I don't know, within the last 10 years, it was Disney or Nickelodeon. I can't remember which one did Teen Beach Party, which is Ross Lynch, I believe, like rose to fame that way. And I wanted to try to squeeze it in because I was curious, because I know that movie blew up very much for young people, and it's in just based on the title, it's very clear that they were pulling from that. It's also a musical. One thing I will say about the Beach Party musical is that the music is not good because they just repeat the same things. So it's like hubba dabba doo boo.
Oh my god, when they start doing the like ring around the Rosie song to like protect the guy, and then they just start doing the, I was like, this is ridiculous. This is like a junior song.
There's one thing also I want to mention from the second. So the second movie is called Muscle Beach Party, and their beach gets infiltrated by a bunch of like muscle guys who are like practicing
as one would. Correct.
Yeah, they're like Arnold guys. They're all like, and Don Rickles is their like coach trying to get them into their muscle shape. But they all have like little names, and one of them is Hulk, and they all have their own colors. And Hulk wears a green tank. And I looked it up, and Muscle Beach Party came out like only a year or two after Hulk debuted, and I'm very curious if this was like the first movie to ever make like a Hulk joke. I don't know. I didn't Google it, but it was definitely one of the first.
Oh, I would not be surprised. Yeah. It's so, I said it when we started this one, but I just can't believe how much this movie that like no one's heard of anymore, unless you're like really in the know. It just has impacted so much. I mean, even today, the McFarlane toy line was like, we have the 60s Batman Surfs Up, Joker's Down toy coming out. And I was like, we're still coming back to that episode, which is from this movie. We're still pulling from these ideas and these things. It's nuts. But the best part about it, and the best way to move on from it, is to do exactly what AIP did, which is after 7 movies, one of the producers just went, they're not into it anymore. The last movie still made money. And the producer just went, I think we're done. And then they made slot car racing movies. Like this was just such a weird little company that would just go, we're gonna do this one for 5 years, we're done. It would be like if Disney after the Avengers was like, that's it, we're done, the superheroes are over. Now it's train robberies that we're gonna do forever. And then they did that for 5 years. Insane. But that brings us into the 70s with George Lucas's second, technically, because he has that short film, but his first Coppola produced feature, which Jamie was 100% right. American Graffiti should feel a lot like Rebel Without a Cause, because this is really more me talking, but I feel like this is one of the first big movies where nostalgia was a marketing tool, where we were like, come back and feel like the 60s again. The tagline was, "Where were you in 62?" 50s nostalgia was sort of on the rise right before the 80s when it was everywhere. And I was like, this really seemed like one of the first efforts to like harken back to an era instead of just be the era. But what did you guys think? What do y'all think?
I love American Graffiti. I grew up on it because, you know, when Star Wars is your favorite movie, you're checking out the dude's other shit. And I really love this movie. What's interesting to watch it, right? So it was made in 73, but it takes place in 62. And 62, it's kind of like that first episode of WandaVision when we're like, Dick Van Dyke is the 60s. Why do they keep calling this the 50s episode? It's the same thing. American Graffiti feels like the 50s, even though it's 62, because that, you know, that's how time works. It's still that era. And
it's still like the feed off of the runoff of the back end of those years. Yeah.
And it's such a, like, this is a coming of age story. I mean, this is their last night before they're all going to go off, or they go into college. They're struggling with the decision. Some of them are, you know, stuck behind, all this stuff. But, and as its own coming of age teen movie, I love it. But it was watching it after Rebel Without a Cause was so interesting because it glorifies that time in such a way, whereas like Rebel Without a Cause was like it was actually made in 1955 and it felt grimy and
living the pain of that
rough.
Yeah.
Whereas in by the time you get to the 70s, you're looking back on that time with like
rose-colored glasses, like that was a good time.
Yeah. And like and it's very much, I mean, this movie is like very sweet and fun. And then the end is fucking, two of them are dead. It does that, like, I always think of it as the Fast Times thing, but this movie's before Fast Times, where they, you know, the classic teen movie, they tell you what happened to everybody. And they tell you what happened to the 4 core guys. And like, one of them dies in the war. One of them gets in a car accident. One of them's living in Canada, so he probably was dodging some shit. But it's like, whoa, I didn't need that. But also it was a good way to kind of to rip back into, because we do have they had nostalgia for that time, but it wasn't, that's not really what it was. But either way, I think I love that movie. It's just written so well. All the characters are so ripe, and it's interesting for me to see Ron Howard. So I believe this movie was a year before Happy Days started. And you know, you associate Ron Howard with that time period because that's around the same time. But Richie Cunningham is such a sweet, wholesome guy, and his character in American Graffiti is kind of a fucking asshole. And and his girl, I think, should have just cut him loose instead of getting him to stay. But it's every time I watch him, I'm like, oh yeah, he's not that great of a guy. Richard Dreyfuss, so good. Just everybody in this movie.
It's a crazy cast. It's a who's who of cast when you look at it. Yeah.
I'm a bit, it's not like my favorite teen movie, but I do think it's one of the more serious ones on our list as well, just in terms of like, there's laughs, but there's not a ton of laughs. It's more about the emotions. It's more about, like, most of our movies that we're talking about are like teen comedies, where this is very much coming of age.
There's a stark difference with like American Pie, with those are sex comedies, but most of those are comedies. Every now and then you'll get a comedy. This reminds me a lot, even though I did not like the movie. Crap, I'm blanking out on it. But this reminds me of the film that just came out this past year with the younger girl hitting, the younger boy hitting
Licorice Pizza.
As far as being as the time period, it's like it's a capsule of that day or of that moment that is sort of kind of reminding.
I love Licorice Pizza, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah, and so that's kind of where this is. I dig this movie a lot. It's a very nostalgic. What I love, though, this is the first time that I noticed. It's one of those films that I studied also in film history. It's the first film that kind of actively used music as being sort of the key point to kind of get you through. So like, all right, how I'm going to remind you of that era? I'm going to bust you over the head with as much music as I possibly can. And I think it's a cool thing that Lucas chose to, music is throughout the entire time. And when he wants you to hit it with a serious scene or a dramatic moment, he just kills the music. There's no sound, which is a fun kind of like, because normally it's the opposite way. But we usually use sound or music to kind of like, I'm going to bring up the score, bring up this moment. He uses silence. And I was like, oh, that's a cool little trick. But like, any movie you think about, or anything just like you think about, you remember the stuff, the music you were listening to, the TV shows that were on, the books you were reading at that point in time. And so this movie does a smart thing, like, I'm just going to beat you over the head, and like all that nostalgia that you felt in that era, that's what this movie is, and it's indoctrinated into the DNA, and it just makes that part of that childhood, or that part of your life, it just emanates immediately from this movie.
Yeah, it's another one that also I was like, ooh, what a lost way of doing. We don't film movies like this anymore. A lot of long shots with one take where we're just watching these people talk. Yeah, it's great. I don't think you could ever say it wasn't. I think when I was in high school, I knew a few people who were like, oh, have you seen his American Graffiti movie? What a dumb thing. But it's like, you'll watch Empire Strikes Back and then someone brings you this. You're like, well, that's not
the same
I don't
guy,
want to do
right?
this. I don't want to watch Dead Alive after I watch Lord. I mean, I do, but some people don't want to watch that, right? But it's so funny, like how important this movie is, because we jettison George Lucas into Star Wars, and obviously Star Wars is all around you now. Harrison Ford, so many just like career defining moments in this movie. And to Jamie's point, it is more of like the drama, but I think what's interesting is how dramatic comedies used to be. Like we now kind of have more dramedies in its own little like slice genre, but I feel like this was what used to just be like, it's a comedy, but it's still a movie.
Mm-hmm.
But we're just gonna have these big, huge moments. And then you can just feel like the breadcrumbs of John Hughes moments, these like disagreements about sex and arguments about music and blasting soundtracks. This was, to Terrence's point, an expensive soundtrack at the time. And now I feel like almost every movie has an original soundtrack album, whether or not music is used the way it is in Guardians of the Galaxy or 80s John Hughes movies, or Wild Wild West for the ending. But yeah, it also, I think, is one of the very first times that we like used politics in the background. Jamie talked about the ending and this implication of draft dodging, and it's such a weird juxtaposition of how the world is going to grow up with these kids. And so many coming of age stories after are about growing up with something else in the background. It very much reminded me of Lady Bird, which is not a 9/11 movie, but like 9/11 is in the DNA of that film. It's like it's brought up in the background. All of these things are happening on the news, and it's like evoked thematically throughout it. Or even like Clerks, which was very how the world around them was changing and how they were growing up and falling behind because of all these things happening. I feel like so many now, when people are like, movies aren't political, I'm like, they all are, but they're doing it American Graffiti style, where it's like, hey, this is all like fun and they're learning and optimistic, but here's the title card at the end to remind you that like the world was also there. All of this stuff was coming.
I also think people often say that a film is political when it is going against the views that they believe in. Like, that's the only, it becomes political then. Otherwise it's like, oh no, this is a great film. Like that's when it's not talking about something that I want to talk about. So now it's trying to be political or woke.
But I guess what I mean more is like, you could talk about this movie without bringing up politics, but like politics is baked into the DNA of it. The same way it is in like the original Star Wars and old superhero movies, and it's baked into everything. But this, like, unlike Rebel Without a Cause, which was so much about James Dean and him and his life and his coming of age, this was very much like that with these characters, but we were aware of what was happening around them too, of like the news and what was coming. And I think that's also, part of the advantage of this is a movie in the 70s about the 60s, where they really could be like, here's how it would have affected them.
Thinking about it, like thinking about the 70s, when I was looking at 70s, there's aren't a lot of teen 70s movies that take place in the 70s. I mean, Grease is as we've discussed, my favorite movie that was made in the 70s, but it takes place in 59, and it's still very much a teen movie, and I think that like this, there's a lot of it was just going back because the times were, nom and shit, and they're like, things were rough, and I don't think until Animal House was 78. And the reason why I didn't suggest that, or we didn't talk about that, I think is because I think college movies count, but I think you got to draw the line when you have only 6 episodes and you got to like.
Well, it's very much the teen era that we're focusing on.
Movies like Animal House did pave the way for when we get to American Pie. Clearly, American Pie is our cornerstone.
I think that was our
exactly.
That's right. Yeah.
When we're doing a 1999 episode, we're going to talk about it then. But that movie changed me, and I think that. But the 70s, I kind of wish I would have like talked to my dad about this, because he was like a teen in the 70s, and I wish I would have asked him like what as a teen he was watching. Like does he have any memories of like being represented on screen at the time that he was existing?
It's interesting is if you sort of look back at our WandaVision stuff, when we talked about the 70s, we said something very similar of like the Vietnam of it all. And TV had become so reflective of the first time we were filming the war, and it was on, and the sitcoms were so Brady Bunch and escapism and Get Away. And, all you hear right now in 2022, our second, third year of COVID, of pandemic, is everyone I know is like, I don't want the COVID movie. I don't want the COVID comedy. I don't want the COVID serious movie. I don't want the COVID horror movie. I don't want a show. I don't want it. And I think that's very much how the sentiment probably was in the 70s. We were doing a lot more sci-fi, Jaws, Star Wars, Superman, where like the end of that time in movies was genre movies, was like, who cares when it is? We were getting into adventure things, and gangster and crime movies were coming back that were also based in different time periods, and we were getting horror in different ways. Halloween and slashers were on the way, and the 70s is such a weird filmmaking time because of that. We're sort of avoiding it, and then towards the end we start really doing the things like Apocalypse Now, when we start making the war movies that are like, fuck all of this stuff, until we got to Top Gun and it was fun again. Like, it's such a, this 70s movies are so interesting for that reason, because when you go back and find them, you're either like really depressed or you're like in like sci-fi horror heaven. Like that's, it's weird. It's a very interesting time, Jamie. And I think you're right. Like, I've never really thought about that either. Because even like that 70s show, like Vietnam, it's the late 70s. Like, we're, even then, even still now, we're like not really getting into it. I think Westerns were also still coming out, but those were dying.
The interesting thing about that 70s show, which starts in like 77, then it lasted 8 years, so they had to kind of readjust the time. But you don't hear a lot about Nam. You hear about Red talking about Korea, because that's the age gap. Like, the kids were too young to get to Nam, and he was too old for Nam. So you hear more about Korea, which I think is interesting. I can't wait for that 90s show, just because of, I'm so interested of the reflections and how that's all going to come together.
Oh yeah, we don't need to stay on this too long, but I just pulled up like the top 70 movies, and it is interesting when you're just like, right away, Logan's Run, Close Encounters, Soylent Green, Willy Wonka, Badlands. It all gets like high fantasy and sci-fi, or it's like The Godfather, Amityville, Deliverance. Like, it's very avoiding of that time.
Being in the moment at that time.
You say Badlands, and that's actually a good example of like teen but did that take place? I just watched Badlands, and that's very much that could go up there with Rebel Without a Cause in terms of similar themes. Yeah, that would be. But you're right. Actually, I don't know what year it takes place, and some of it is like, a lot of the big ones are late 70s. Like, it really, Jaws, Carrie, but that's fine. So that's sort of where we were. The only other thing I wanted to reference before we're like, why did we compare these 3 movies from the 50s, 60s, and 70s to a 2002 pilot about Kamala Khan in the MCU?
And according to masterclass.com, which is where I could find the best defining instance of coming of age genres, because we could all do it ourselves, but why not have this website that won't even tell me who wrote the article about it do it? Obviously, it's young adult stuff, and there we go. Well, that's annoying. That is. So really, it says that it follows a protagonist and their transition from childhood to adulthood, which I think has now expanded to any change of any period of your life. The genre of storytelling is usually popular with literature, and movies in Hollywood will feature the stories about critical junctures between childhood and adulthood, romance, graduations, rebellion, all of the things that we've sort of touched on. And then it talks a lot about how, like, first was all adaptations of books, Little Women, Wizard of Oz, and then here we are. So why do these three ones, do you think, hit? Is it thematic? Is it just the evolution that we're on? I feel like you can pull a lot from even like Beach Party and American Graffiti into even what happened in the pilot with just her resistance and want to escape and independence.
Yeah, I mean, with Rebel, with the dog, it's different, but there is a thing here with Kamala and her, with the way that her parents are and the culture that she's in, that they have a tighter grip on her than I think she would desire. So she's asking for that, like she's bucking the system, and it's always that thing where teams. There's a point in time, especially with Jamie can probably speak to this more, but there's a point in time where girls and moms become each other's worst enemy. And so that's kind of that point where they're sort of hitting where the road is hitting the pave, and it kind of just they're bucking the system. And we've seen that with these movies. All three of these films have some version of that. Beach Party, to a lesser extent, it's more they're kind of just being watched, and the system is being the adults are telling us that's what the teens act like. But for the other two, we kind of see that those teens are getting to that point where they are questioning both themselves, what they're supposed to be doing, the life around them. And then this one has the added benefit of also she's now gaining power. So in addition to growing up as a teen, doing her normal stuff, she's also now getting to this world where the people that she used to, well, she does still idolize, she loves and idolizes, she's now about to enter that world with him. And that's going to get screwy too, because if she starts seeing that the sheen that they had may not be the sheen that she wants to wear, it's going to be an exciting time for a teenage girl to go through all of that shit at once.
Yeah,
I agree. I think you also see a lot of the stuff we sort of talked about with American Graffiti. The world's changing around her too, and I think she, like in a lot of these movies, adulthood looks exciting. There's always kind of a like, I want to get there, whatever MacGuffin thing of like what it means to be an adult is there. Beach Party aside, because I feel like that's similar to the college movies. Like the teens have no supervision, so we are just observing them. It is kind of the like they've done it, they've made it to the independence, and now we can explore and be ourselves. But the other two are so like, well, I've got to get to this, and it's our last summer, and we're gonna get to this, and then we see those four heroes at the end of American Graffiti and what they all got. And it's interesting is I think we know where the superheroes end or don't end. If you want to compare it to like Cap going off or Tony, or to Jamie's point, we've seen the trauma of these shows and the trauma of the world of the MCU. And we're watching a girl who grew up watching them the way that like we watch athletes. I don't even want to say like we watch superheroes, because that's pop culture. I'm going to use like, I guess athletes is the best I can think of.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, ooh, don't you want to do that? And you want to go to the conventions and see the adults, and they're incredible and they say the right thing and they do it. And then you get under the hood of it.
And you're like, oh crap.
And I think that's going to be a big part of this show is like what happens, what you get when you get what you want, and when you grow up, and maybe you grow up too fast, and maybe you get things that you thought you were ready for, but you're not. Because we've seen a lot in these legacy stories of like, don't meet your hero. And I think even like Spider-Man's story was the best case scenario of meeting your hero. And we've seen it in so many other places in the MCU. And now we're really seeing this, like, it's not really about meeting your hero. It's about becoming that hero.
Yeah.
And it's not whatever Vought Light is doing in the MCU to make it all look pretty and fun. It is like Captain Marvel's off in other worlds, and Ant-Man has a podcast, and Tony snapped and died, and the Hulk's arm is destroyed and Clint is deaf, and like all of our older heroes have these scars now that clearly isn't at Adventure Con. There was no little quarter that was like, do you guys want to see the tragedy?
I will say that it did please me that they gave both Tony and Widow the memorial. I was like, good, it's not just Tony anymore. She's gone. Please give her flowers.
Oh yeah, I mean it's interesting. I'm very excited to see where it goes. I think you're right. I think we get a lot of the DNA, especially in like the first episode with our first coming of age stories, as that kind of set that ground of like, this is what we're going to deal with. She's going to be rebelling with her parents the whole time. We haven't really met a traditional antagonist yet, so I am curious, are we just going to kind of keep it coming of agey and have it more be like rebelling against people, or are we going to get some super powered? It is an MCU show, and as we sort of said on WandaVision, we played grief and we did fun and we did our sitcoms, but then we had a big sci-fi battle at the end.
Yeah,
we're always going to have the big battle at the end, so that has to come. Obviously we're going to get more about the bracelets and these powers and all this other stuff, but that's our show, guys. I know this one was longer. There was a lot to cover as we got through the grounds. We have a lot more fun stuff coming up. Obviously, what this is really going to get into is 1999 overall. A lot of people call it the golden age of usually like the romantic comedies, but there's so much other coming of age stuff in there too. Just a treasure trove of independent, weird voices. We have everything from the 2000s, Booksmart, 8th grade. John Hughes is coming. We stepped off in the 70s, so like every history podcast, we have to hit the 80s, which we will not stop referencing now, apparently. That's it. That's where we all ended. But
for those listening who are watching along with us, next week is our John Hughes retrospective, because you wouldn't have the modern teen comedy without John Hughes. But also, I highly recommend watching Fast Times at Ridgemont High, because that was made in 1983, and it also is very much the pinnacle. It is in a way, I think one of the first, the famous, the one, and I think that, and even if we're not touching on it much next week, I highly recommend giving it a watch.
She's absolutely right. Do it, and then leave us a review, and then share it with your friends, and then follow. I'm at As Always Blake, Terrence is at Terrence Tatum, and Jamie is at Jamie Cinematics. We obviously have the Hollywood Already Did It podcast about reboots, remakes, and sequels. Terrence does the Hollywood Already Did It YouTube channel for trailer reactions and show-by-show reviews, and Jamie has Phase Zero that she's on and all of her other writing at comicbook.com, and we will see everybody next week for the next 6 weeks.
Later.